Hello and welcome to this tutorial on how to make the Tlaloc pattern by Telabeja. You will find the link to the pattern in the description of this video. This pattern comes in 3 different views. In this video I'm mainly making the Raincoat view, which is the longest one. But the methods for making the other views are pretty much the same, and I will always tell you when the steps are different for the other versions. For my raincoat, I'm using a yellow soft shell fabric. This is perfect for a raincoat since on the inside it has a soft fleece and on the outside it's a waterproof fabric. And besides, it has this lovely yellow color, perfect for fall. And as I cut my pattern pieces, I make sure to cut them on the grain line by aligning the arrow on the pattern pieces. And I like using my rotary cutter to cut the pattern pieces on the cutting mat. Make sure to read the instructions before you start cutting, so you can check which piece needs to be cut on the fold or which piece needs to be cut only once. For the bottom placket, for example, it needs to be cut only once, and the hoodie mid piece as well. After cutting, it's important to mark all the notches and positions of the pockets and buttons onto your pattern pieces. And now we can move on to the first step, which is to finish the edges of the pocket pieces with bias binding. I'm using my bias tape and I'm simply folding it around the edges of the pocket flap. If you're new to sewing bias tape, I recommend you start by sewing the open bias tape to one side first. And then fold it over and sew the other side. But since I've done this many times before, it's way quicker for me to just directly sew it on folded over. When you're sewing over the rounded edges of the pockets, make sure to stretch the bias tape slightly so it eases into the curve. Then I move on to applying some snap buttons to the pocket flap and the pocket itself in order to be able to close it. This is optional. If you don't want any buttons on your pocket, you don't have to add any. But especially for the raincoat, I like adding snap buttons since I ride my bike a lot and this prevents the flap from opening and the contents will not get wet when it's really rainy and windy outside. And then I simply sew the pocket to the location marked at the front piece. And I add the pocket flap directly above. Make sure to align the buttons so that it closes properly. And now we can move on to sewing the shoulder seams. Simply put the front and back pieces right sides together, then sew as usual. And I like finishing these seams with bias tape as well, but this is optional. First, I'm opening it up to sew the inside to one side of the seam allowance first. And then I trim seam allowance to be able to fold over the bias tape more easily. Then I fold the bias tape over the seam allowance and sew it in place. If you prefer, you can also finish the seam with an overlock or another method. But since we have a lot of bias tape for this pattern on the outside, I like using it for the inside seams as well. It makes it look very neat since the jacket is not lined. The next step is to add the sleeves to the armhole. Pin the sleeves to the armhole by aligning the notches to the shoulder seam and the notch at the back piece. Then sew with 1 cm seam allowance as usual. Of course, this seam is a bit trickier since it's curved. But just take your time and readjust the pieces in between if necessary and you will get it right. To speed it up, I already added my bias tape with the seam on one side. Then I'm trimming the seam allowance as before, folding over the bias tape to the other side. And to get a neat finish, I sew the bias tape over the seam allowance, and now it's hidden and it looks very nice. This is the finished result for the armhole and for the shoulder seams. And now we can sew the side seams closed. Simply put the front and back right sides together. Align the underarm seams and then sew all along the side seam with 1 cm seam allowance. And I also finished the seam with bias tape with the same method as before. Now we move on to the hoodie. If you choose a version with a hood, simply take the middle piece and sew it to both side pieces along the curved edge. You might need to ease it in a bit since you're aligning a rounded edge with a straight edge. This time, finishing the seam with bias binding is not optional, since this seam inside your hoodie will be visible from the outside. Just apply the same method as before and it will look very neat. Then before moving on, we need to finish the front of the hoodie with the bias tape as well. So simply fold it over the open edge again to sew on the bias tape. Now I already added my iron-on interfacing dots for the rivets, but you can also add buttonholes for inserting the string for the hood later. And after adding the rivets, I simply fold over the front edge by 1.5 cm and top stitch it in place. This will be the tunnel for the hoodie string. Perfect! Now that that is done, I will show you how to sew the collar for the other version. You simply put the collar pieces right sides together and then sew the short sides together with 1 cm seam allowance. Trim the corners and then turn it inside out. And iron it well so you get a neat collar you can attach to your jacket later. The next step is the same for all views. Pin the hood or collar to the neckline of the coat, aligning the center backs. It is important to leave 1 cm surplus on each end at the center front for attaching the zipper later. Then sew it together with 1 cm seam allowance as usual. For the collar, you need to sew both layers to the neckline at this step. Then I finished the seam with the bias binding method. I then folded the bias binding downwards and top stitch it again. If you want to, you can add a label at this step too. Next up, we will finish the edge of the button placket with bias tape, just like with the pockets. I just fold the bias tape over the raw curved edge of the button placket and then we can add the interfacing dots for the snap buttons. I'm using see-through snap buttons. You can use metal ones or colored ones. The application is quite simple. After poking a hole, insert one side and then put the other side on top. Use the designated tool to fix them in place so they won't budge. Repeat this for all 5 to 7 buttons. Next, we need to finish the hems of the jacket using bias tape. Just as before, I'm folding the tape over the edges of the sleeves and of the bottom hem while sewing it in place. For the sleeves, you need to fold over the bias tape and before you finish the seam to conceal the raw tape edge. And this is what the finished hems look like now. Now we can proceed by adding the zipper. You will have a zipper of different length for each version. For view Z, align the zipper to the top of the center front. For views X and Y, align and pin the zipper starting from the bottom. And sew it right sides together, starting with the side that will not have the button placket. I prefer having the button placket on the right side of my coat since I'm right-handed. Be aware that the zipper for the longest view is significantly shorter than the center front. That is why we align the zipper starting from the top. Next up, we can sew the other side of the zipper. If you are adding the button placket, put it in between the zipper and the jacket, right sides together. And then I sew in the button placket and the zipper in one go. If you're not adding a button placket, of course, just sew the zipper to the front. And again, I'm finishing off the seam with bias binding, applying the same method as before. And I'm doing this for both zipper sides. Now I'm folding the finished seam allowance over to the wrong side of the coat. I want to top stitch it just to make it look extra neat and to keep the zipper in place. And I'm doing this for the other side as well. And this is what it should look like afterwards. For the next step, close the zipper and mark the locations for the snap buttons on the opposite side. In my case, I put them on a little bit too close to the edge and I would recommend you to place them further away. Now it's time to insert the string to the hoodie. You can use a safety pin or any other tool you have for inserting strings. The last detail for view Z is to add elastic cuffs. For this, put some 4 cm wide elastic around your wrist and cut it to a comfortable length, including the seam allowance. Then fold the sleeve hem inwards by 4.5 cm. And sew a tunnel for the elastic. Make sure to leave a gap for inserting the elastic band. Now we can insert the elastic with a safety pin. Then I sew together the ends and close the gap with a few stitches. And that is all. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, feel free to leave a comment, like and subscribe for more sewing patterns and sewing tutorials. See you in the next one. Bye!